6:45 in the morning, November the 19th, 1952. The driver of the Merthyr Tydfil passenger service pulled on his coat, checked his watch, and stepped into something that looked less like a railway platform and more like the inside of a cloud. Snow had been falling since Tuesday. It was still falling now. The Welsh valleys in November are not a gentle place. The ridgelines catch weather coming off the Atlantic, compress it, cool it, and drop it on everything below. The valleys themselves act like funnels, channeling wind down from the high ground in ways that strip the warmth from anything exposed. The trees understand this. They grow sideways. The stone walls understand this. They are 3 feet thick. The railway workers, most of them local men who had worked this line for 20 years or more, understood this too. What none of them had prepared for, because no one living could remember it happening before, was 3 meters of snow. Not 30 centimeters, not a foot and a half. 3 full meters. Packed, compacted, wind-driven snow, filling the cuttings between the valley walls as though someone had poured concrete from the ridgetops down. This is the story of the snowiest November in England since 1919, of a passenger train swallowed whole by drifts in the Welsh valleys, of a railway network caught completely off guard with its snowplows still in the shed, and of the men who dug with their hands when the machines ran out of answers. To understand why November 1952 caught everyone so badly, you need to understand what November is supposed to be. November is autumn. It is mud, drizzle, fog over the Severn, leaves blocking the drains along the valley floors. It is cold, certainly, but cold in the British sense, meaning you wear a second jumper, not meaning you question whether civilization will survive the week. British railway companies by 1952 had developed an entire seasonal logic around this reality. Winter equipment, the heavy snow ploughs, the steam lances for clearing points, the additional grit stocks, the second crews trained specifically for blizzard operations, was typically deployed in December, sometimes late November, but not mid-November, not the 19th. The system assumed certain things. November was not the problem. December was the problem. January was definitely the problem. The weather had not read the schedule. The depression that caused all of this formed over the Atlantic in the second week of November, moved east, and then did something depressions are not supposed to do. Instead of tracking north as expected, it locked onto the English Channel and sat there, drawing cold air down from the northeast in a pattern that meteorologists later described as exceptional. Air that had travelled across Scandinavia and the North Sea arrived over Britain carrying temperatures that had no business being here in the third week of autumn. At Kielder in Northumberland, thermometers dropped to minus 12 degrees Celsius. At Dalwhinnie in Scotland, they recorded minus 15. These are winter readings, January readings. In the uplands of Wales, in the valley heads above Merthyr and Rhondda and Aberdare, temperatures fell below minus 8 and stayed there for 4 consecutive days while the snow came down without interruption. On the lowlands, the flatlands of the Midlands, the coastal plains, the accumulation reached 15 centimetres, enough to cause disruption, enough to strand a few lorries on the A roads and cancel some rural bus services. In the higher ground, the figure was 30 centimetres, 12 inches, a proper snowfall by anyone's measure. But in the valley cuttings of South Wales, where the railway lines ran between steep walls of rock and earth, something different was happening. The wind was taking the snow from the exposed ridges and pouring it downward. The cuttings were collecting it. Some cuttings had been designed decades earlier to be exactly the right shape to act as perfect traps for drifting snow. The Victorian engineers had not considered this possibility when they chose their routes. They were thinking about gradients and coal tonnage, not about what happens when 3 days of northeast wind follows 3 days of heavy snowfall. By the morning of November 19th, certain sections of track in the Welsh valleys were buried under drifts that the first crews to investigate could not fully measure, because their measuring rods were not long enough. 3 meters, roughly 10 feet, as deep as a double-decker bus. The passenger service that became trapped had departed on time, which is itself a small piece of black comedy worth noting. The driver, a man named Gwyn Thomas, who had driven this valley line for 11 years, had looked at the conditions and raised his concerns with the station master. The station master had made inquiries up the line. The word that came back was that the route was open. This was technically true at the moment the message was sent. The situation was changing by the hour, but the communication system that might have tracked those changes in real time did not exist. Thomas accepted the clearance, fired the locomotive up to operational pressure, and pulled out of the station at 6:45. He got approximately 4 miles. The drift that stopped him was in a deep cutting on the valley side, a section of track that curved slightly to the left and then straightened between walls of exposed rock. The snow had piled into this curve from the exposed ridge above. Thomas later described seeing the white wall in front of him perhaps 40 yards before impact, at which point his options were essentially zero. The locomotive hit the drift and drove into it for a distance of perhaps 12 feet before stopping completely. This was not a collision. There was no violence, no derailment, no injury. The train simply stopped. And then the snow, which had been disturbed by the impact, began to settle around the carriages. Within 20 minutes, the doors could not be opened from the inside. There were 61 passengers aboard. The first hour was orderly. Gwyn Thomas was an experienced man in difficult conditions, and he had enough common sense to immediately have his fireman, a 23-year-old named Dai Evans, work on maintaining steam pressure. The heat from the locomotive would be the passengers' main defence against what was now, outside the sealed carriages, a temperature of -6 degrees Celsius and falling. Thomas worked his way through the carriages, doing a head count, checking for anyone with health conditions that might become urgent. He found an elderly woman with a heart condition, a mother with an infant, and a man who had, somewhat misjudgingly, dressed for his destination rather than his journey, and was wearing a light suit and leather shoes. Thomas organised the passengers to give up their overcoats for the infant and the unsuitably dressed man. Nobody refused. The Welsh valleys in 1952 were not a place where people refused such requests. The train had no emergency radio. It had no direct communication to the signalling box beyond the standard track circuit signals, which were now indicating accurately that the train was stopped in the cutting. The signalmen who saw this would know something was wrong. The question was how long it would take for that knowledge to result in action, and what kind of action was actually possible. It took 2 hours for the first rescue party to reach the edge of the drift on foot. They were railway workers from the maintenance gang based at the next station up the valley, 5 men with shovels who had walked 2 miles through conditions that were, by their own later accounts, unlike anything they had encountered in their working lives. The snow on the open hillside was knee-deep. In the hollows between the ridge and the valley floor it was chest-deep in places, and the wind was blowing hard enough to make sustained effort in any direction almost impossible. When they reached the cutting and looked down at the drift, they stopped. Even one of them later told a journalist from the Western Mail that none of them spoke for perhaps a full minute, because what they were looking at was a wall of snow that showed, at its visible surface, absolutely no indication of a train. Just white. Solid, compressed, wind-sculpted white. They began digging at 8:45 in the morning. The word that got back to the railway district office in Cardiff was stark. A passenger train was entombed in a cutting in the valley. 61 passengers, including an infant. The line was impassable for at least 2 miles. No powered equipment had yet reached the site because the access roads to that section of valley were themselves blocked. The decision that followed was made quickly, and it revealed the structural problem that November had exposed. The district office needed snowplows. To us, the snowplows were in storage. Getting them operational, attaching them to locomotives, checking the hydraulic and mechanical systems that had sat unused through an entire spring, summer and autumn would take time that the 61 people in that cutting did not obviously have. They ordered everything into service simultaneously. 3 snowplows to be prepared, additional manual labour to be organised, railway workers, any available men, and moved toward the site by whatever means could be found. The roads were impassable, but the valley floor tracks might still be clear enough for a locomotive without a full train, moving carefully and alone. A single locomotive, stripped of everything except its crew, was pushed out of Cardiff at 10:15 in the morning. It made slow progress northward, stopping twice to clear sections of track that had accumulated shallow drifting. At 12:40, it stopped permanently at a drift that stretched across the full width of the valley floor track, depth unmeasured, but clearly beyond anything a locomotive could push through without proper equipment. The crew climbed down and began walking. The 61 passengers in the cutting had now been stationary for 6 hours. Gwyn Thomas had kept the locomotive running, and the heat in the forward carriages was manageable. The rear carriages were colder, perhaps 4 degrees inside, which is unpleasant and potentially dangerous for sustained exposure, but not immediately lethal. The infant was warm. The elderly woman with the heart condition was resting. The man in the light suit had been given 3 borrowed overcoats and had stopped shaking. What Thomas could not manage was food or water. The railway service carried neither, and the passengers were beginning to feel the absence. More pressingly, 6 hours is a long time for 61 people to manage the basic requirements of being alive, and the sealed carriages were becoming increasingly uncomfortable in ways that Thomas had to address, with considerable diplomatic skill and a great deal of improvisation. He later described this as the hardest part. Not the cold, not the uncertainty, not the knowledge that help might be hours away. The hardest part was maintaining morale in a confined space when people were frightened and uncomfortable, and had been stationary since before 7 in the morning. He walked the carriages every 30 minutes, he talked to people. He answered questions honestly when he had answers and said clearly that he did not know when he did not. He kept his voice level throughout. This is a specific skill. Not everyone has it. The rescue grew incrementally, awkwardly, the way rescues in impossible terrain always do. By early afternoon, 4 separate teams of workers were digging into the drift from the accessible end. They had no mechanical equipment. They had shovels, and they had a problem that anyone who has dug snow understands immediately. The faster you remove it, the faster the wind puts it back. The ridge above the cutting was still exposed. The wind was still blowing from the northeast. Every shovelful removed from the face of the drift was replaced by material moving down from above. The solution, worked out by the senior maintenance foreman, a man named Idris Price, who had 30 years of Valley Railway experience, was to stop trying to fight the wind and start trying to route around it. Instead of digging into the face of the drift, Price organised his teams to cut down from above, working from the ridge level, creating a channel that would allow the snow to be moved sideways off the ridge, rather than piling back into the cutting. It was slower to start. It required getting men to the ridgetop in conditions that were, charitably, hostile. But it was the only approach that would actually work. Price himself climbed to the ridgetop in the early afternoon and stood in wind that he later said nearly took him off his feet, looking down into the cutting where the top of the locomotive's chimney was just barely visible. Just barely. A thin black line against the white. And he organised the ridge teams, 16 men, shovels, working in 20-minute rotations because the exposure at that elevation in those temperatures was beyond what any individual could sustain for longer. They cut the diversion channel through the afternoon. At 4:27 in the afternoon, 9 hours and 42 minutes after the train had stopped, the first section of carriage roof became visible from the cutting floor. 20 minutes after that, a door was opened. Gwyn Thomas stepped out into the cold air and shook hands with the foreman who had led the interior digging team. He then went back inside and organised the evacuation of his 61 passengers. They walked out of the cutting in single file, guided by ropes that had been strung between the digging teams to mark the safe path through the remaining snow. The infant was carried. The elderly woman was supported on both sides. The man in the light suit was wearing 3 overcoats and moving under his own power, which he seemed to consider a point of personal honour. All 61 passengers reached the valley floor without serious injury. 2 were treated for mild hypothermia. The infant, according to the medical report, was entirely unaffected. The investigation that followed the November 1952 event was thorough, and its conclusions were not comfortable for the railway authorities responsible for the Welsh Valley network. The core finding was simple. Winter equipment deployment had been scheduled according to calendar assumptions that the weather had comprehensively invalidated. The decision to begin winter readiness in December reflected decades of operational practice, built on the reasonable expectation that December was when serious winter conditions arrived. November 1952 demonstrated that this expectation was not a law, it was a habit. The report recommended advancing the winter readiness schedule by 3 weeks. It recommended the installation of additional meteorological monitoring at key ridge stations in the Welsh valleys, where conditions could deteriorate significantly faster than the lowland weather report suggested. It recommended improvements to emergency communication systems on valley lines, so that a stalled train could communicate its situation directly rather than through the indirect evidence of track circuit signals. It also noted, in language that was characteristically understated for such documents, that the performance of Gwyn Thomas in maintaining passenger safety and morale during the 9 hours and 42 minutes of entrapment had been exemplary, and that his approach to the management of a difficult situation with limited resources might usefully inform training programs for drivers on exposed rural routes. Thomas, when told about this commendation, is reported to have said that he had simply done his job and that anyone else on that line would have done the same. This was, in all probability, not entirely accurate, but it was exactly the right thing to say. The Chilterns, in the same week, became effectively impassable. Communities that expected to spend November preparing for Christmas spent it instead waiting for roads to clear, supplies to arrive, seest neighbours to check in. The snowiest November since 1919 had arrived without announcement and departed on its own schedule, leaving behind disrupted rail lines, buried villages, and a very long list of things the railway system needed to reconsider. The Welsh valleys recovered within a week. The tracks were cleared, the services resumed. Gwyn Thomas drove his next scheduled service 2 days after the rescue, on the same line through the same cuttings. He was asked later whether he had been concerned when he saw the snow building up before him on that November morning. He said he had been concerned about his passengers. He said that he had not particularly been concerned about himself. The cutting where the train stopped was subsequently fitted with additional windscreening on the ridge above. The drift that formed on November 19, 1952 has not formed again to that depth since. Whether that is because of the screening or because the weather has not yet repeated itself, no one can say with absolute certainty. What is certain is that 61 people walked out of a buried train in the Welsh valleys on a November afternoon, cold and hungry and stiff and alive, and that a railway driver and a maintenance foreman and 16 men on a ridgetop in the wind made sure that they did.